Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and this week with Rabbi Adam Mintz we learn of the first commandments the Jews were given as they left Egypt. They were instructed to mark their doorposts with blood and put sign on their hands and between their eyes. We explore how a commandment like this can mean different things to different people and at different times. So get ready for our weekly journey and walk like an Egyptian. Well, welcome. It's great to have you here. Very excited about this discussion. We've been studying the Torah week in and week out. Those of you who remember when we studied Bereshit, we studied a very famous Rashi who said, why doesn't the Torah begin from when God made the first commandment? It's a book of law. It should be Rosh Chodesh Tiyeh Lachem. And here we are in Parshat Bo, and we're getting some commandments. Things are changing. We're moving from stories, from narratives, to actual commandments. The rubber is hitting the road. So today, we're going to focus on the beginning of one commandment. We're going to start with Exodus 13, where it kind of starts by talking about the stuff we'd expect it to talk about. It says, throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found with you, and no leaven shall be found in your territory. And you shall explain to your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. And this shall serve you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. You shall keep this institution at its set time from year to year. So I like to read the Parsha afresh every year. And when I read it this year, I was absolutely struck by this introduction of what many of us will recognize to be a law of Tefillin, these frontlets, these phylacteries, these leather objects that traditional Jews put on their arms and put on their heads. And it's smack in the middle of what we absolutely expected to hear, which is the story of unleavened bread, how they had their first Seder, how they had their first Passover, and how that influenced further celebrations of the Passover. But right in the middle is this law that resonates clearly, the law of Tefillin. But it doesn't really say anything about writing. It says, this shall serve to you as a sign. So the first question is, what is this? When we read it later in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, we kind of say, oh, okay, so it's this paragraph that we need to put inside of the Tefillin. But here there's a question of what is the this in the this? And then in Exodus 13:16, just a little bit later, it says, and so it shall be a sign upon your head and a symbol on your forehead, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. And here we have this strange word in the Hebrew that not only should it be a sign, an ot, a word that we have come across before, but it should be uletotafot bein einecha, this totafot between your eyes. So am I the only guy who read the Parsha this week and said, what is Tefillin doing here? It's not something that we normally associate with either leaving Egypt or with the first commandments that are given. And it's not quite talking about writing anything, and it just seems so strange to appear here. And this was, frankly, the first year that I realized that here, when we're listing the first mitzvot, the first commandments, boom, we're hit by this non sequitur, I would say, of the law of what ultimately became Tefillin. Anybody share my surprise?
There's no question that point is right. Let's just review for a minute that in the Tefillin that you described, there are actually four selections from the Torah. 2 of those selections are from this week. Actually, chapter 13 is divided in half because there are 2 references, as you said, to Tefillin. So there's the first portion at Kadeshli, and then the second portion, V'haya Ke'viacha. And then there are 2 more portions, the first 2 paragraphs of the Shema, which are found in the book of Devarim of Deuteronomy, also which have mention of Tefillin, and they're also included. So there are 4 selections in the Torah that talk about Tefillin. All those 4 are in the Tefillin that we wear. And the question, I think, is, as you said, why is it here? What does it have to do with the Exodus? So let me, Geoffrey, make the question bigger. This is actually the first parsha that we have in which we have a combination of law and narrative. Up to now, the Torah has been completely narrative. There have been a couple of little laws here and there, but basically the Torah has been completely narrative. All of a sudden, in this week's portion, chapter 12, we switch, and we have a combination of law and narrative. That's the first important lesson. And that is that the Torah is a combination of law and narrative. Each one plays on the other. To understand the laws, the rituals of Passover, you have to understand the narrative of the Exodus. So that's interesting. Now, why is Tefillin here? The reason Tefillin is here is very simple. And that is because the remembering the Exodus is primary in everything that we do. That seems to be the most basic, if not, or one of the most basic laws that we have. And therefore, the Tefillin in chapter 13, those paragraphs, remind us of the Exodus, and we put them on our hands and on our head because we need to remember the Exodus. We need to remember the slavery, and then we need to remember how God took us out of Egypt.
I just wanted to first say, every morning we have this Zoom Parshat HaShavua class. So I'm following along, Yetziat Mitzrayim and Pharaoh and all this. And then it just struck me this year. I didn't understand what was this text doing, like smack in the middle of the storyline. So just to say I resonated with your question, I did.
Reuben, there must have been something in the water this year. I don't know.
Oh, so then the other thing, Rabbi Mintz, you taught me about the website Al HaTorah. And in the morning, as they're reading, I try to find the Hapax Legamas in the Parsha, or words with very low frequency. And here, L'totafot is once in this Parsha, and then when it comes around back in Dvarim, it mentions it 2 more times. So it's a very, very rare word in the Torah.
But let me just, add to the question a little bit. If you look at Rashi, when Rashi says, "V'hoya lecha la'ot," it should be to you a sign. He says, "The exodus from Egypt shall be to thee a sign. Yetziat Mitzrayim tihyeh lecha la'ot." There's already a sensitivity to what is this in the this. What is the sign? Now, we sometimes talk about the personalities that we're talking about. I think the Rashi family had a little bit of a monopoly on Tefillin. First of all, it's pretty well known that the daughters of Rashi wore Tefillin. And the Rabbeinu Tam was a grandson of Rashi, and the very, very observant Jews put on 2 pairs of tefillin every day. They put on Rashi tefillin and Rabbeinu Tam tefillin because the grandson argued with the grandpa about the order of the parshiot. But there was another grandson. Rabbeinu Tam had an older brother, and his name was Rashbam. And Rashbam says something amazing on this verse. He says, according to the true meaning, an exhortation that this memory should be with you permanently, as if, ke'ilu, the matter is literally inscribed upon your hand. And he says we have similar metaphorical expressions about putting things on your body. He says in Song of Songs, it says, place it on your heart as if it had been engraved there. And take it on my word, there are commentaries like the Ibn Ezra and others who understand exactly what the Rashbam is saying. He's saying, don't talk about the other instances of the mention of this law that ultimately became tefillin, these black boxes of leather that we put on our body parts. Here it is a metaphor. Here it is in the tradition of a Jeremiah who says, and you should write these words on your heart. He goes and quotes multiple verses where this concept of wearing God on one's body is a metaphor. So there's clearly a fascinating aspect of how it's easy for us to say we're talking about tefillin, but it's not totally clear that we're talking about tefillin as we know it. We're talking about an aspect of tefillin, and that blew me away.
I want to say something to what you just said, and then something back to what Rabbi Mintz just said. I think that when the Rashbam is talking about the metaphor of, on your heart, between your eyes, in those ways, he's talking more about where you wear the tefillin, right? Because he's telling you that you wear the tefillin on your arm corresponding to your heart. You don't wear it literally on your chest, and likewise, you wear the tefillin that go on your head, between your eyes, on top of your head, right? Not literally on your nose, between your eyes. And I think he's trying to use he's trying to use the terms and metaphors that way, so that the practice of wearing tefillin corresponds with the meaning of the verse. But even so, right, even as you take them metaphorically, he's describing a very, very embodied experience, right? You're literally taking these reminders of the Exodus and you're strapping them to your physical body and you're walking around with them. You're wearing them and you feel them and you're touching them and they're part of how you get around your day. And so much of what we do to remember the Exodus on a day-to-day basis, or the mitzvot that are connected to it, are very embodied mitzvot, right? We eat things, we drink things, we say things, we hear things. And the way Rabbi Mintz was talking a little bit before about the combination between law and narrative and how those two formats kind of play into each other and inform each other, I think what this is showing you also is that there's even a deeper level to it, or a deeper connection, because even the remembering, even the mitzvah itself, is so physical. It's so embodied. And tefillin really sums it up more than almost anything else.
By Avram, I think that's really such a good point, that actually the relationship between law and narrative is reflected in the selections that we use for the tefillin, and that actually when we put them on our arms and on our head, we're thinking about that relationship, not just the law of putting on tefillin, but the narrative, the Exodus from Egypt. I just will add one thing, Geoffrey, and that's you made reference to the fact that there are two traditions. Hasidim put on two pairs of tefillin. They put on Rashi's tefillin at the beginning of davening, and at the end of davening, they take off their Rashi tefillin and they put on the Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. And they look the same, but inside there's a difference. And the difference is what the order of the portions is. Rashi's tefillin, which is the tefillin that are generally used by most people, have the order of the portions in the order they appear in the Torah. So therefore, you have the two portions from chapter 13. Then you have the portion of Shema. And then you have the portion of the Haya'im Shamoa. And that's the order in which they appear in the Torah. Rabbeinu Tam has it different. Rabbeinu Tam says you start with the two selections from this week's Parsha, Kadesh and V'hayaki V'yacha, but he switches the order of the two chapters in Dvarim. And he says first is V'haya'im Shamoa, and finally is Shema. He switches the order of Shema and V'haya'im Shamoa. The question is, what difference does it make? It would make sense. Rashi makes sense. You should have the selections in the order in which they appear in the Torah. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik gave an amazing explanation. He said, actually, the four selections are actually two different themes. This is what Rabbi Avram was referring to. The selections from our portion are talking about the Exodus. The selections from the book of Deuteronomy talk about Tefillin as an expression of our acceptance of God's kingship over us. So actually, according to Rabbeinu Tam, they are in order. But one you read from left to right, and one you read from right to left. So the two portions from our chapter, you read from left to right. Kadesh v'haya kiviyacha. But the portions from Devarim, you read from right to left. Shema v'haya im shamoa. And the reason we do it that way is because we want to separate the two, to show those are two different things. One is about remembering the Exodus, and one is about remembering that God is king over the world. And those are two very distinct themes in our Jewish lives. So I think that that's just interesting to at least for a moment to pay respects to Rabbeinu Tam and his different tefillin than Rashi's tefillin.
So I love this discussion because as I started, we are discussing the first mitzvot that are commanded to the Jewish people. In a sense, and some of the commentaries make this distinction, they're pre-Sinai revelation as well. And here we are, and we're looking at all of the different perspectives that you can have on this one. I would say it's a seed of a mitzvah, because I am not willing to concede yet that the mitzvah of tefillin is fully played out yet. I want to get back to the Rashbam. One of the commentaries that I have in the source sheet says, Rashbam einu ro'eh b'psukenu azkera shel mitzvot tefillin ela meforsho metaphora. The idea that this commentary is saying is, at this point in time, does the Rashbam believe that there's a commandment of tefillin? He does. He's not a Karaite. He's not a Samaritan. There were fundamentalists who read not only these verses, but the later verses, and they said, it says you should write these words on your doorpost. The Samaritans wrote them literally on their doorpost. They talked about writing these words on your arm and on your head. They took it as a metaphor. The Rashbam is lahavdil, not in that camp. But what he is saying is, at this point, it's a metaphor. And what I love when we discuss Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi and their different views of what should be inside of the tefillin is, here we have the first commandment. Yes, the first commandment that picked out Reuben and Mai's eyes because it was literally made as a commandment. It didn't fit into the narrative that much. And all of a sudden, we can parse it in so many ways. And I'd like to think that this is an example of all the mitzvot that are to come. And yes, there is an aspect of this commandment that is totally physical, but the Rashbam is saying something very profound, that you can take a commandment as a metaphor, and that doesn't detract from taking it also as a physical, tactile directive as to what to do in the first 4 hours of the morning. And that, I think, is an amazing thought. And I'd like to use that as a segue to then get into the various interpretations and explanations that Reuben talked about, which is, what does this totafot mean? At this point in time, where are we? What does this mean? It's clearly using a foreign term and making reference to something that the audience that it was written to understood, but that we do not. What do you all feel is going on here in terms of what is totafot?
Haftorahman, what do you think?
I'm gonna digress for a second on purpose. These prayers are in two places. One on the mezuzot and two on the tefillin. And not that this adds credibility, but the story was told to me by Mr. Shlomo Musayev. And Shlomo said originally they didn't have doorposts. They lived in tents. And that this scroll was a kamea, and they would hang it like a lintel. And that when somebody would go into their tent, they would have to move their hand in front of them across to the side, and they would touch the mezuzah, thereby merging the heaven and the earth by touching the mezuzah, which was this go-between area. So to me, that sounds beautiful on a thought level. Then the other thing I think about is the name of God. You only have two places, Rabbi Mintz, correct me if I'm wrong, where you have the shin on the mezuzah bayit and the shin on the tefillin boxes for the shin daled yud name of God. So I always found that interesting too.
Okay, and how does that relate to the word totafot?
Okay, so we're here. L'totafot, I'm just going to read what they had in Al Torah. It says bands. So they must have just tied these things. And I think also, Geoffrey, that the Samaritans like put it like in between their eyes, their tefillin, like right down on the forehead, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, let's get to the bands. The most straightforward explanation is in the Gemara in Shabbat 57b, and it says the Mishnah said that a woman may not go out with the ornament called a totafot. We're talking about on Shabbat. The Gemara asks, what is a totafot? Rav Yosef said, a packet of spices to ward off the evil eye. Abai said to him, and let the legal status of this packet be like an effective amulet, whose effectiveness is proven, and it should be permitted, as an effective amulet may be moved on Shabbat. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Abai, a totafot is a apuzein, an ornament worn on the forehead. This opinion was also taught in the Breita. A woman may go out with a gilded hairnet worn to hold the hair in place, and with the totafot and with the severtin, and are fastened in the hairnet. What is a totafot, which is severtin? Rabbi Abu said teferet, which goes around her forehead from ear to ear. And I think that's the opinion that you quoted. But the point is, even modern scholarship, and if you look at the notes on Sfirah to this thing, it gets into great detail and basically says, I think the rabbis of the Talmud had it right. Totafot was, as you said, Reuben, a headband. And we come across for the first time, it's to ward off, it's an amulet. Again, the tefillin strikes us, Western moderns, as very strange. But my guess would be that whether you called it a kamea or whatever, in the ancient world, people wore charms, people wore amulets. And it was an accepted practice to wear an amulet as a headband and on one's arm. I'd like to point out that one of our faithful listeners, Bob, who's in the audience today, pointed out a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago, that they just discovered a pharaoh. They were able to do a scan of him without actually touching him, and they found that he was circumcised, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But they also found a bunch of amulets, a bunch of jewelry on his arm and stuff. So I gave the subject matter of tonight's talk, Walk Like an Egyptian. It seems to me that, number one, we can all assume that, unlike us, when the Torah said totafot, everybody understood what it was referring to. It wasn't speaking in riddles. And so it seems pretty clear that this was some sort of an amulet, both on one's head and on one's arm. This question, and I'll just give two other references to trigger further discussion. it has this strange expression of between the eyes. Le'ot al yadecha and lezicharon bein einecha. Those of us whose children ask us, "Are you allowed to have a tattoo?" We always said, "No, you can't have a tattoo." It says in the Bible itself, in Deuteronomy 14, "You are children of the Lord your God. You shall not gash yourselves or shave the front of your heads because of the dead." Now, I just read a translation. But the Hebrew says, "Lo korcha bein einechem lamet." You can't make a mark on yourself. You can't cut yourself bein einechem, between your eyes. And it's fascinating that when the rabbis discuss that, korcha means to make oneself bald. So they actually learn from here that tefillin is not to be actually between one's eyes, but it's to be above the hairline. So they actually learned from the law against gashing and pulling out one's hair, maybe making tattoos and signs, that it is above the hairline. There's a real connection here, and these are not stuff that was made out of nowhere, yesh me'ayin. These were amulets. These were signs that were made. The other word that's used is an oat. And of course, we find that with Cain, the sign of Cain. And in the Midrash, it says, what is the sign of Cain, the oat of Cain? Well, God took one of the otiyot, one of the letters of the 22 letters of the alphabet, and wrote it on Cain. So we almost have tattooing here, which is kind of fascinating. So that kind of really opens up the discussion in terms of what from a metaphor to a tattoo to a amulet, what this could be referring to and what its antecedents are.
So I would add the following, and that is that maybe we don't know what the word totafot means. And maybe that's the idea. Maybe tefillin is the perfect model of the integration of the written Torah and the oral tradition. That without the oral tradition, we can't know what tefillin really are. The Gemara says, in another Gemara, it says that tat means two and pat means two. And totafot just means four, that we have four selections from the Torah. And maybe that's what we need. Maybe we have to be willing to admit that if all we have is the written Torah, that's not enough. We need an oral tradition. We need a living tradition. A bunch of years ago, there was an exhibition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of the things they found in Qumran. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they had in the exhibition was a pair of tefillin. And I was always struck, Qumran is about 2,100 years ago. And the tefillin from 2,100 years ago looks basically the same as the tefillin we put on today. That's an amazing statement about Jewish tradition. Jews have been thrown out of places. Jews have, been prosperous in places. A lot has happened to the Jews over 2,100 years. But the tefillin are still the same tefillin that we had. And probably for 1,000 years before that, they were the same tefillin. And that's part of our living tradition. It's similar, by the way, Geoffrey, to the etrog. The Torah says you should take a fruit from a tree. We don't even know what the fruit is, pre-Eitz Hadar. And the way we know what an etrog is, that's part of the living tradition. We need the living tradition. Without the living tradition, we have nothing. And I think that totafot, the tefillin, actually is a great model of that.
I totally agree with you. The only thing that, I would add, and we've talked about so many facets of this one of the first commandments that we've come across is, one of the questions, and I'll save this for my, Shabbat, Pesach, Shabbat HaGadol Drasha, is the obvious question of why mezuzah isn't mentioned here after they put the blood on the doorposts. And maybe, Rabbi, you'll talk about that on Shabbat.
That's good also. Okay,
but it seems to me that there's another element here. And in the New Testament, when Jesus talks about the Jews wearing tefillin, he says in Matthew, everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and tassels on their garments long. And what he captures is this sense of pride, this sense of who we are. And it seems to me, and you were talking about this living tradition, I'm not a scholar. I thought of the Egyptians have every time you see an Egyptian pharaoh, you see that little snake that comes out right on the forehead as a sign. It was not worn by a foreigner. It was not worn by a layman. It was only worn by a king. And I'd like to think that another aspect of tefillin is that these Jews, they might have put on the blood on the doorposts so that the God would pass by and spare them. But when they were told to put these ornaments on, they were like kings. Mamlechet Kohanim v'goy kadosh. And I would like to think that that is also part of the aspect of what we're talking about. That this tefillin and this commandment here is this sense of being like a pharaoh, walking like an Egyptian, so to speak. And the ultimate lesson and the ultimate takeaway is in half an hour, I think we've probably touched upon 13 or 14 different ways of looking at this one of these first commandments of mitzvah. And I think what we can learn from this, and I'd like to extrapolate going forward, is that not only are there shivim panim leTorah, 70 faces to every verse and every idea of Torah, but a mitzvah, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's Tefillin, whether Pesach, can be taken at a metaphorical level. It can be taken as an amulet and a little bit of superstition. It can be taken as a political statement. It can be taken as a fashion statement. It's all there. It's all acceptable, and all that we are asked to do is to study the texts and become a part of that tradition. And I'd like to think that's the element of living that you were describing in terms of what the oral law is.
That's beautiful, Geoffrey. What a way to end. Enjoy the Parsha, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to taking the Jews out of Egypt and crossing the sea next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Amen. Shabbat Shalom. We will see you all next week and discover another hidden aspect of the Torah and hopefully find something that resonates with us. So with that, I bid you all Shabbat Shalom, and let's all leave Egypt together this week. Shabbat Shalom.